The evening descended on the poor village as the last weak rays of sunlight filtered through the gaps in the leaves, sparkling faintly on the dilapidated thatched roofs. The sound of the wind howling through the fragile gaps in the doors blended with the slow, weary footsteps of a woman returning from the garbage dump. That woman was Lei, a single mother living in a small, shabby house with her 2 young children, Mai and Kwang. Their house stood at the edge of the village, nestled among withered old bamboo bushes. The thatched roof had deteriorated, patched with old tarpaulins. On rainy days, water would seep into the house, chilling their hands and feet, but no one in the village cared. They only knew Lei as a poor woman who scavenged for a living, surviving on what others discarded. Lei was no longer young. Her face bore the marks of time and hardship. Wrinkles fanned out from the corners of her eyes, her sun-darkened skin, and her calloused hands were covered in scratches. Each day she rose early and left her ramshackle home to head to the large garbage dump on the outskirts of the city. She quietly picked up scraps, broken glass, beer cans, old newspapers, anything that could be exchanged for money. Despite the hardships, Lei never once complained. For her, seeing her 2 children healthy was enough to keep her going. But her resilience couldn't always overcome the loneliness in her heart. 15 years ago, Lei's life had been different. She once had a happy family. Her husband, Hue, was a kind man who adored his wife and children. He was the family's breadwinner, a skilled construction worker, well-liked by many. But tragedy struck when Hue suddenly disappeared during a work trip without a word or a trace. He vanished from Lei and her children's lives as if he had never existed. In the early days, Lei searched everywhere for her husband. She asked around and even went to the big city, knocking on the doors of houses where Hue had worked. But all her efforts were in vain. People said he had met with an accident and died. Lei refused to believe it. She couldn't accept that painful reality. Despite the gossip, pitying looks, and even disdainful remarks from people in the village, she held on to hope. "How long has he been gone? What are you still hoping for?" An elderly neighbor once sneered. "He's probably left to start a new life elsewhere." Those words cut into Lei like a knife, but she didn't respond. She had no time for pointless arguments. She had to live, raise her children, and most importantly, cling to the belief that he was still alive, that one day he would return. Her 2 children grew up enveloped in their mother's boundless love, but couldn't escape the deprivation. Mai, her 15-year-old daughter, was mature for her age. She tried her best to help her mother, from washing clothes and cooking to taking care of her younger brother. Mai was an excellent student but never dared to dream of leaving the village, knowing her mother couldn't afford higher education for her. Kwang, her 10-year-old son, was different. He didn't yet understand his mother's hardships. Kwang often felt upset when his friends mocked him. "Your family is so poor, and you don't even have a dad." Those words made Kwang angry, but all he could do was cry and run home. Many times he asked his mother, "Where's my dad? Why doesn't he come back to us?" Each time she heard that question, Lei's heart tightened. She didn't know how to answer. All she could do was hold her son close and whisper, "Your father will come back one day. He will come back." That evening, as usual, Lei went to the garbage dump. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in a radiant orange-red hue. The scenery was strangely beautiful, but to Lei, it was just part of her daily, familiar surroundings. She bent down to pick up scraps, her hands moving deftly, her eyes focused. The sound of a car horn startled her. She looked up to see a sleek black car pulling up not far from where she stood. A man stepped out of the car, dressed in a sharp suit. He walked with an air of confidence, his cold gaze sweeping across the area. Amid the garbage dump, as if it was a place he never wished to set foot in, Lei stood frozen in disbelief. She couldn't believe her eyes. The man looked too much like Hue. Every feature on his face, his tall and lean build, those eyes, all of it reminded her of the husband who had been missing for 15 years. An Hui. The name escaped her lips softly, like a breeze. But in her heart it resonated like a thunderclap. The man paused, turned, and looked at her. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. Lei felt as though time had stopped. Old memories flooded back, the happy days they had shared, the promises he had made to never leave her, all of it crystal clear in her mind. But the man's eyes were cold and unfamiliar. He frowned, his face clearly showing annoyance. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone firm and distant. "You don't recognize me? It's me, Lee, your wife," she said, stepping closer. Her trembling hand seemed to reach out instinctively, longing to touch him, to confirm that this was no dream. The man took a step back, his gaze growing even colder. "I don't know who you are. I'm sorry, but you've got the wrong person." With that, he turned, got back into his car, and drove away, leaving Le standing motionless in the vast expanse of the garbage dump. She didn't cry then. She just stood there, staring at the car as it disappeared from sight, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Was that man really high, or was it just someone who bore an uncanny resemblance to him? If it was Hui, why didn't he recognize her? Why was he so cold and distant? As the last rays of sunlight disappeared entirely, Le dragged herself home in the darkness of night. Silent tears rolled down her face. But deep in her heart, a small flame still burned faintly. She couldn't let go of the belief that Hui was still alive, that he was somewhere out there, and that their story wasn't over yet. That night, after her children had gone to sleep, Le sat alone by the dim light of an oil lamp. Her calloused hands gently stroked an old photo frame, where Hui's blurry but warm smile remained faintly visible. She thought back to the cold eyes of the man at the garbage dump earlier that day. Those eyes, so sharp and indifferent, were like a dagger cutting into the hope she had nurtured for 15 long years. She couldn't sleep. Doubts gnawed at her endlessly. Was that really Hui? If it was, why had he turned his back so coldly? What had happened to him all these years? She knew she had to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The next morning, Lee gathered what little savings she had and decided to go to the city. Mrs. Sao, an acquaintance who collected scrap materials like Lee, had mentioned that the garbage dump where she had seen the man was near a wealthy neighborhood. "They're all influential folks in that area," Mrs. Sao had said. "If you want to know about someone, just ask the security guards or the workers around there. They know a lot." Lee nodded her thanks, her heart filled with determination. She took Mai with her, unwilling to leave her daughter alone at home with Kwang. Their journey took the entire morning, winding through crowded streets Lee had never set foot on before. When they arrived, Lee was overwhelmed by the sight of luxurious mansions and shiny cars passing by, never stopping. She asked around cautiously, speaking to a motorbike taxi driver and even some street vendors near the area. Finally, a middle-aged woman selling sugarcane juice pointed her toward a specific place. "The man in the black suit? If that's who you mean, he might be Mr. Hung, the chairman of a big company nearby. He lives in the mansion at the end of this street." Lee's heart raced. Hung? That name sounded so unfamiliar. But his face, his eyes, she couldn't mistake them. Something didn't add up. The man she saw and the Hui she had known seemed worlds apart. She decided to go to the mansion the woman had mentioned. As she approached the gate, she was immediately stopped by a security guard. "What do you want?" "This is a private area," the guard said sharply. Lee hesitated, then spoke nervously. "I just want to meet Mr. Hung. I have something important to discuss with him." The guard frowned, eyeing her from head to toe, taking in her shabby clothes and worn-out appearance. She didn't belong in a place like this. "Mr. Hung doesn't see strangers. Leave before I call the police." A wave of helplessness washed over her. But just then, from a distance, a familiar black car rolled into the driveway. Lee immediately recognized the man inside, the man she believed to be Hui. Without thinking, she ran forward, standing in front of the car, her eyes blazing with determination. The car screeched to a halt. The man stepped out, his face full of irritation. "Who are you? How dare you block my car?" His voice was deep and cold, making Lei instinctively take a step back. But she mustered all her courage and spoke. "You're Hui, my husband, aren't you? You can't deny it." The man frowned, his expression momentarily troubled, but he quickly regained his composure. "You're mistaken. I'm Hung, not Hui. Please stop bothering me." Before Le could respond, he turned and walked into the house, leaving her standing there, shattered. But in that fleeting moment, his eyes, those eyes that had avoided hers, full of hesitation, betrayed his words. She couldn't be mistaken. As Hung disappeared inside, a maid emerged from the mansion. "Step out, pull her aside and lower his voice. You want to know about Mr. Hung, right? I have something to tell you." Li looked at the woman with pleading eyes. What do you know? Please tell me. The woman Tao said, Mr. Hun wasn't originally from here. I heard he used to live somewhere else, had a major accident and lost his memory about 10 years ago. He was adopted by a wealthy family and then started building his career. I'm not sure about everything, but people in the village say he's not really from the Hung family. Li felt her mind spinning. A major accident? Memory loss. That could explain why Mr. Hun didn't recognize her. Why he was living a completely different life. Please, can you help me meet him again? I need to know the truth. Li begged. The maid hesitated, but eventually nodded. I'll try, but you must be careful. Don't cause trouble, or both of us will be in danger. That night, Li was secretly led into Mr. Hun's office. When he walked in and saw her, his face immediately darkened. I told you not to look for me again, he said. But this time, Li didn't let him refuse. She pulled out an old photo from her pocket, a picture of Hui with her and their 2 young children. Look at this. This is you. This is us. You can't deny it. Mr. Hung stared at the photo, his hands trembling slightly. A flash of confusion crossed his eyes. I don't remember anything. I don't know what you're talking about. That's because you've forgotten, Lei said, her voice breaking. They took your memories, your life. But you are Hui, my husband, the father of Mai and Kwang. You don't belong here. Mr. Hung turned away, but Li caught a glimpse of a tear sliding down his cheek. In that heavy silence, it seemed as though a long-buried secret was on the verge of being revealed. The truth behind Hai's disappearance and the accident that erased his past. That night, the confrontation between Li and Mr. Hung was only the beginning of a journey to uncover a truth buried for 10 long years. Li returned home after the emotional encounter, her heart filled with both hope and uncertainty. Could she truly break through the wall of mystery hiding Huai's past? That night, she couldn't sleep. Questions kept swirling in her mind. Mai, her eldest daughter, noticed something unusual about her mother. The girl quietly approached and asked, Mom, what's wrong? I've noticed you haven't been happy since yesterday. Li looked at Mai with tender yet sorrowful eyes. She hugged her daughter tightly and said, Mai, I think I've found your father, but it seems he doesn't remember us anymore. Mai was stunned, her eyes wide with shock. She didn't say anything further, but silently held her mother's hand, giving her strength she didn't know she had. 2 days later, Li decided to return to Mr. Hung's mansion. This time, she not only wanted to uncover the truth about his identity, but also the reason why Hui, if it truly was him, was living a completely different life. With the maid's help, she was led into a small room where Mr. Hung was waiting. When he saw her, he sighed, his face showing clear annoyance. You don't know how to give up, do you? I told you I'm not the person you're looking for. Li held his gaze firmly, completely opposite to the unease in him. If you're not Hai, then why did you look at that photo the way you did? Why did you cry? Mr. Hung was startled and didn't know how to respond. Then he turned away, his voice cold. I don't have any obligation to explain anything to you. Li didn't back down. She pulled out another item, an old silver bracelet Hui used to wear from their wedding day. She placed it on the table and looked straight into his eyes. You once said this bracelet was the only keepsake from your mother and that you'd never part with it. So why, when I found you on that garbage dump that day, was this bracelet in my hands? Mr. Hung looked at the bracelet, his expression changing. His hands trembled slightly as if faint memories were resurfacing. But he quickly masked his reaction, his voice growing harsher. You're mistaken. I don't know where you got this, but it has nothing to do with me. Li realized a thick veil of secrets was shrouding him. She knew that to uncover the full truth, she had to dig deeper into the world he was living in. Li left the mansion feeling disappointed, but on her way back, she accidentally overheard a group of people talking near the area. One man in the group whispered, That Mr. Hung, huh? They say he had a serious accident when he was young, went missing for years, and suddenly came back to become the president of a big company. There's definitely someone powerful backing him. Li froze. A serious accident? She remembered what the maid had said before. It seemed there was a chilling connection between Mr. Hung's past and Hui's disappearance. Li decided to investigate further into Mr. Hung. She sought out an old friend of Hui's, Thang, who had worked with him in a timber factory before. When he disappeared, upon hearing Lee mention the accident, Thang was stunned, his face turning pale. Lee, if it's really that accident, then things are not simple. Back then, Hui discovered a major corruption case in the factory. He intended to report it, but just a few days later, he disappeared. People said he died in an explosion, but no body was ever found. Thang's words struck Lee like a thunderbolt. She had never known about this. Was Hui harmed? Could the accident have been more than just a mishap? Lee returned to the mansion once again, this time with determination to face the truth. She spoke directly to Mr. Hung. If you're not Hui, let me go. But if you really are him, you cannot keep running away. Someone wanted to harm you. Perhaps they placed you here, turning you into their pawn. Mr. Hung was stunned. Lee's words seemed to touch upon a deep fear within him. I don't know what you're talking about, his voice trembled. You know exactly what I'm saying, Lee continued. Think back. Who saved you after that accident? What did they do to turn you into someone else? Are you truly Mr. Hung, or just a facade they created? Mr. Hung sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands. The image of a cold, powerful man vanished, replaced by someone tormented by vague memories. Perhaps I need time, he said, his voice conflicted. Lee looked at him, her heart breaking. But she knew this was only the beginning of the fight to reclaim the husband she loved. Ahead of her lay the dangers of powerful enemies and secrets more horrifying than she could imagine. After the tense meeting, Mr. Hung fell into a state of deep contemplation. Lee's words echoed in his mind, the silver bracelet, her pained eyes, and especially the question, "Are you high?" Everything felt like strange fragments struggling to connect and reveal a truth he had forgotten. That night, Mr. Hung couldn't sleep. In his dreams, disjointed images appeared. A dilapidated little house, the laughter of a gentle woman, and two carefree children playing near the fire. He woke up drenched in sweat. Was this a memory he had lost? Lee did not give up hope. She searched for any clue about Mr. Hung's past. In one conversation with a servant, she learned that Mr. Hung had lost his memory after a horrifying accident 15 years ago. He was saved by a man named Truong Van Kai, the chairman of a major corporation, who took him in and helped him build a career under a new name. Hearing Kai's name made Lee's heart tighten. Kai was the former director of the wood factory where Hui worked before his disappearance. She no longer doubted. Kai was the one behind everything. Lee decided to confront Kai. She went to his office, unafraid of his powerful demeanor. "What have you done to us? Why did you turn him into someone else?" she shouted. Kai laughed coldly, his eyes full of disdain. "How dare you speak like this in front of me? Hui is long dead. The person you're clinging to is Hung, the man I saved and gave a new life to. I don't believe you. You think your power and lies can cover the truth forever? Hui isn't dead. You used him and turned him into a puppet to serve your interests." Lee's words made Kai pause, but instead of denying it, he gave a sinister smile. "Yes, Hui was once a thorn in my side, but Hung now is a different man. Even if he remembers, do you think he'd choose you over the luxurious life I gave him?" Lee left, her heart full of anguish, but she didn't give up. She believed that love and memories of their family would help Hui rediscover his true self. In the days that followed, Mr. Hung grew increasingly uneasy. Lee's words, Kai's attitude, and the strange dreams all made him feel like he was living a life that wasn't his. He began to quietly investigate his past, piecing together remnants of memories. One day he visited the small village where Lee and their two children lived. In stark contrast to his luxurious mansion, Lee's house was old and dilapidated, but it radiated a strange warmth. Standing at a distance, he watched Mai and Kwang playing joyfully together. His heart ached with a deep sense of familiarity, as if he had once been a part of this place. Lee stepped outside and saw Mr. Hung. Her eyes were a mixture of surprise and hope. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mr. Hung didn't answer immediately. He stepped into the small house, his eyes scanning every corner. Each place he looked brought back another piece of his memory, a family photo on the wall, an old coat hung by the door, and especially Mai's eyes, which looked eerily like his own. Mr. Hung began, his voice hesitant. "I don't know who I am, but this place, these things, they feel so familiar." Lee couldn't hold back her tears. She stepped forward and held his hand. "You are Hui, my husband. This is our home. These are Mai and Kwang, our children. Even if you've forgotten, our love is still here. Our family is still waiting for you to return. Lee's words shattered the final barrier in Mr. Hung's mind. Memories came flooding back like a tidal wave. His accident, the years of struggling to make a living, and Lee's smile. He clutched his head in pain, but at the same time a warm feeling spread through him. Hui, I am Hui, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. In the days that followed, Hai, once known as Mr. Hung, began to reintegrate into his family. However, he couldn't ignore his responsibility to his current life. He knew that to truly protect his family, he had to confront Kai. Hui decided to expose Kai's crimes. With Lee's help and the assistance of some old colleagues, he gathered enough evidence of Kai's corruption and abuse of power. The final showdown took place in a courtroom, where Kai was brought to light and faced justice. Hui abandoned the name Mr. Hung and gave up all his wealth to return to his family. He knew that the years of separation couldn't be undone overnight, but the love of Lei and their children motivated him to start anew. One evening, the family sat together under the soft glow of an oil lamp. Lei was mending clothes, Mai was reading a book, and Kwang was excitedly talking about his school adventures. Gui watched them silently, his heart filled with peace. Lei, he said, his voice choked with emotion, I'm sorry for making you and the kids suffer all these years. I promise I'll never lose you again. Lee smiled, holding his hand. We've waited for you to return, and that's enough. Family is the most important thing. In their small home, laughter echoed warmly. In the end, love and regret had brought them back together, closing the chapter of suffering and opening a new one filled with happiness. Despite life's storms, Lee's family finally reunited. Yet, life continued to test them as they worked to rebuild both their love and their future. Hui used the skills and experience he gained while living as Mr. Hung. Though he gave up his wealth, he still had valuable connections in the business world. He started a new venture with an old friend in the village, opening a wood factory. Through hard work and dedication, Hui quickly regained trust from clients. Lei, though strong, couldn't hide her worries. She feared the challenges of their new life would drive Hai away again. But Hui reassured her. I've lost you once, he said. I won't let anything take my family away again. Mai, though just a young girl, was determined to earn a scholarship for university. She wanted to study education to help other impoverished children. Kwang, once prone to tantrums and rebellion, became more mature. He helped his parents with chores, studied diligently, and no longer feared being mocked by friends. He proudly said, "My dad is the best person in the world." One day, a special event took place in their little home. Mai received a full scholarship to university, and Kwang earned high marks and was awarded a certificate from school. As the family gathered around the dinner table, their laughter rang out. "We've endured the hardest days," Le said, her eyes full of emotion as she looked at Hui. "Now it's time to truly enjoy happiness." Hui held her hand, his voice warm. "Didn't I promise to make it up to you and the kids? I'll spend the rest of my life doing just that." In the days that followed, Hui and Lei didn't just live for the present, but built a brighter future. They renovated their home, turning it into a cozy refuge. Together, the family planted vegetables and raised chickens, simple activities that brought them closer. Over time, the wounds in their hearts began to heal. Hui no longer had nightmares about the past. Instead, he learned to cherish his family through small, everyday acts, fixing a door, playing games with Kwang, or simply listening to Lee talk about village stories. Lee, once a woman who had endured so much pain, now found her radiant smile again. She understood that happiness wasn't about luxury, but about the moments spent together as a family. Mai, though venturing out into the world, always remembered the small home where her parents taught her the value of love and resilience. Kwang grew into a confident young man who appreciated everything he had. One afternoon, the family sat together on the porch, watching the sunset. Hui spoke, his voice full of emotion. "I once thought I'd lost everything, but it turns out the most precious things were always here, waiting for me to come back. Thank you, Lei, for never giving up on me. Thank you, kids, for giving me the chance to be a good father." Lee smiled, her eyes glistening in the sunset. Family is where we belong. No matter how far we go, no matter what we face, As long as we have each other, we can always start again. Their laughter and loving gazes filled the peaceful air. And so, Lee's family story ended not with a perfect conclusion, but with a simple, genuine happiness, a happiness they had fought together to achieve. Their story stood as a testament that no matter how many storms life brings, love and forgiveness have the power to heal all wounds.